Good morning. Good morning, Dr. Crawford. We'll continue with your evidence now, so Miss Thompson, when you're ready.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Crawford.
Good morning.
Yesterday afternoon, I think we maybe went a little off topic, and it was absolutely my fault. But what I'd like to do this morning is get back on point and really focus on the matters that will help the chair. I'd like to look at any evidence that is available to the chair for his consideration regarding any injuries to Nicole Short's back, and whether that evidence is consistent with the stamps as described and demonstrated by Constables Tomlinson and Walker. And we're going to do that this morning, you and I, by exploring three areas. Firstly, I'd like us to look at Nicole Short's medical records and identify any entries that may be consistent with the stamps to her lower back or kidney area as demonstrated. Then I'm going to invite your comment on the evidence given by Mr. Ian Anderson, who expressed the view that the injuries that he noted when he examined Nicole Short on the 21st of May of 2015 were not consistent with the stamps as demonstrated. And finally, we're going to look at your inquiry statement briefly and clarify your position for the benefit of the chair. So we're going to begin by looking at some medical records, Mr. Crawford, and I understand that you would ordinarily wear prescription glasses for looking at medical records.
Correct.
And you've perhaps left those behind this morning.
Correct.
But you do, by happenstance, have a pair of prescription sunglasses in your briefcase.
Yes. I'm very embarrassed about that. But
Please don't be. Please don't be embarrassed in the slightest. The most important thing is that you're able to read the text in front of you. All of the notes are in hard copy. We may bring some up on the screen, but I'm going to ask you to simply look through notes to identify entries for me. So if you'd be more comfortable doing so with your prescription sunglasses on, then please feel free to pop them on. So we don't need to bring these up on the screen just now, Ms. Wildgoose, but I'm going to ask you firstly, Mr. Crawford, to look at the accident and emergency notes from the 3rd of May of 2015. And they will have a PERC reference on them, which is 01158. That might help you to find them in the folder.
See. 1158.
It may be that Mr. Bruce or Ms. Pang might be able to...
Oh, sorry. There's no. Right. Yes, I have.
At the very beginning,
yes,
there we are.
Very beginning. Yes.
There are only a few pages of notes. And what I will ask you to do, there are only 2 pages of handwritten notes completed by Dr. Mitchell. Could I ask you please simply to cast your eye over those notes and identify any entries that are consistent with stamps to Nicole Short's lower back or kidney area as demonstrated. Please take the time that you need to read through the records. Please don't feel intimidated by the silence.
Thank you.
Having read the notes, Mr. Crawford, if you form the view that there are no entries that would be consistent with the stamps we saw demonstrated, please just tell me and we'll move on.
Yes, I am familiar with the notes, but I was just reading them again. There is no reference to any injury or injury mechanism like that in these particular notes. The only thing that I previously noted but which is not directly relevant to stamps, so I don't know whether I should even mention it, was that there is an entry on a blank page here that's not annotated in any way, but it says query loss of consciousness, punches to back, head, and you know, which implies or suggests that there was a head injury. But that's not related to stamping.
And the chair heard from Dr Mitchell yesterday as to who may have made that entry and the significance of it. So rest assured that's not a matter that need concern you today. So we can move on then from the notes from the Accident and Emergency Department on the 3rd of May of 2015. And we'll look now at the report and notes prepared by Dr Norrie, the forensic medical examiner who examined Nicole Short later that day. And again, what I'm going to ask you to do, Mr Crawford, is look through these notes and identify for the chair any entries that you consider are consistent with stamps to the lower back or kidney area as demonstrated by the officers. And for present purposes, I don't think we need to concern ourselves with any entries to do with head injuries.
Sure. Okay.
Now, these have PERC references 01310 and 01301. I'm not sure where in your folder they will be.
Here, yes, I have them.
You
here.
have them?
Yeah. So 01310.
01310 is the typewritten report.
Right.
01301 are the handwritten notes that preceded it.
Right. Again, there are none.
All right. Let's move on then to the records from the Accident and Emergency Department. On the 4th of May of 2015, they have PERC reference 01160. Are you able to find those, Mr Crawford? They're
Yes, I've got them.
grand. Again, please take the time that you need. You mentioned yesterday afternoon that you recalled somewhere seeing a reference to
Yes, it's in these records.
paraspinal
That's
tenderness.
correct.
It's here, isn't it?
It is. It was on the attendance at the emergency department on the 4th of May,
Well then,
2015.
Let's bring these records up, please, Miss Wildgoose. This is PERC 01160. And the relevant entry, I think, Mr Crawford, is on page 5.
Yes. It's a little bit lower down.
Bottom
It's-
right-hand
there it is,
corner.
that's it.
There we are.
Mild right paraspinal tenderness.
And just to help those who are looking at the screen, that's in the margin on the right-hand side of the page. Is that right?
That's correct.
And if we look slightly to the left, do we also see recorded no C-spine tenderness from, no
Yes.
C-spine tenderness FROM, which I think is full range of movement.
Full range of movement, yes.
Neck, no TLS spine tenderness.
Thoracic, lumbar or sacral spine tenderness or bruising.
Thank you. And then in the margin, mild right paraspinal
Yes.
tenderness. And that's the entry that you recalled ringing a bell with you yesterday afternoon.
Yes, and that's the area. These notes refer to specific bony tenderness of the spine, and that entry refers to the muscles around the spine, in this case on the right side, where I was referring to yesterday, which is also coincides with the kidney area, that kind of area. And so I formed the view that that was supportive evidence of an injury there, and that could be attributed to a stamp.
I see. Am I right to understand that the paraspinal muscles run from the top to bottom of the spine on both sides?
Well, yes, but these ones actually run from the lower thoracic area to the pelvic area. So these are lumbar muscles. They're predominantly in the either side of the lumbar spine, the ones that they're referring to there.
And what makes you think that the reference is to the muscles in the lumbar spine?
Because it's in the entry where she's examining the spine, and it's right next to where she says that there's no bony tenderness of the thoracic, lumbar or sacral spine. So in paraspinal muscles, in clinical practice, that would normally be referring to that area of the body at the time they're examining them. If it was cervical spine, because you could say paraspinal in relation to the cervical spine, but most people don't, they would say cervical spine, but that would be in relation to the cervical spine. So that's put in there, and that was my interpretation of it.
So that's how you've interpreted
That's
what's
how I've
written in
interpreted
those
it.
records.
This is the right paravertebral muscles. In other words, the right lumbar back area of the spine.
Mr. Crawford, I'm going to ask you to consider some evidence that is before the inquiry in written form from Dr. Smead. And Dr. Smead is the doctor
Yes.
who made these entries. Now, you have not seen this before.
No.
But if I can ask you, please, Ms. Wildgoose, to bring up on the screen SPBI 00121, and we'll just satisfy ourselves that this is, in fact, Dr. Zoe Smead's statement,
Yeah.
and it is, and it was given to a member of the inquiry team on the 4th of April of this year. Can we scroll down, please, to paragraph 60 and 61, and I'll read these out, Mr. Crawford, to save you having to put your sunglasses on again. 60. I have been referred to the medical records at page 5. No C-spine tenderness, FROM neck, mild R paraspinal tenderness. FROM means full range of movement. She's moving her neck normally. She had no tenderness over the bones in her neck. She had some mild tenderness to her right paraspinal muscles at her neck, which are more muscular, and she was able to fully move her neck. So you do that if you're worried about looking for a fracture with the neck. I test tenderness by feeling down the spinal bones and checking if it is sore. I've been referred to the medical records at page 5. No TLS spine tenderness bruising. This means she has no thoracic, lumbar or sacral spine tenderness or bruising. In light of that evidence, Mr. Crawford, and the clarification that the tenderness was mild and was to the right paraspinal muscles at her neck and not in the lumbar spine, as you had understood the position to be, do you consider that the entry on page 5 of the records that we looked at a moment ago is consistent with the stamps to the lower back or kidney area as demonstrated by Constable Tomlinson and Constable Walker?
If that doesn't refer to the area, to the entry, no thoracic, lumbar or sacral spine tenderness or bruising, if it doesn't refer to that, then I would interpret that as being that there was no evidence of injury in that area.
So no evidence of injury in the thoracic, lumbar or spinal
If
area.
that entry didn't apply to if the marginal note didn't apply to that entry.
Which it doesn't. The evidence before the chair by the author of that note is that the marginal note does not apply to no TLS spine tenderness bruising, but does apply to no C-spine tenderness FROM neck. That is the entry to which the marginal note refers. That being the case, do you consider that the entry is consistent with stamps to the lower back or kidney area as demonstrated by the officers?
Well, if it doesn't refer to that, then no, it's not consistent with that.
Would the tenderness in the right paraspinal muscles be more consistent with Nicole Short having been struck to the back of the head behind her right ear with such force that her feet left the ground?
Sorry, would you repeat that question, please?
Of course. I'm wondering whether the tenderness in the right paraspinal muscles of the neck might be more consistent with Nicole Short having been struck to the back of her head behind her right ear with such force that her feet left the ground.
It would be consistent with that, yes. It would be entirely consistent with that.
We'll move on. Can I ask you to look at another set of records? These are slightly longer. Perk 01361. We don't need these on the screen, thank you. Let me know when you find these, Mr.
Yes, I have
Crawford.
them. Yeah.
They're a little bit longer and they encompass records relating to an acute admission on the 10th of May following a call to NHS 24, CT scans from the 11th of May, and a GP referral from the 18th of May to the maxillofacial unit where Nicole Short was seen on the 8th of June. So they are quite long. Please take the time that you need to go through these records. And again, I'm going to ask you to identify, for the benefit of the chair, any entries that you consider are consistent with a stamp or stamps to the lower back or kidney area as described and demonstrated by the officers.
Well, on page 9, dated 8th of June 2015, it says referred by GP, and the presenting complaint is there of weakness of the right lower face and reduced sensation right side of face, and which is slowly improving. But in the history that's been given to the doctor who's made these notes, it says that she was kicked and stamped on the head.
Yes. Would you forgive me for interrupting you there, Mr.
Yes.
Crawford? I anticipated that you might note that entry, and we see it, I think, on at least 3 occasions within this bundle of notes. And Ms. Short was asked about this in her evidence, and she gave very clear evidence that she has no recollection of being kicked or stamped on the head. No one told her that she was kicked or stamped on the head. There is no eyewitness evidence whatsoever before the chair to that effect. And this appears to be a rogue entry. We cannot explain how it came to be in the records. She does not consider that she provided that information to the doctor. She can't explain how it got there. But there is no information or evidence before the chair to suggest that she was kicked or stamped on the head. So if we could perhaps leave references to kicking or stamping of the head to one side, because they appear to be without foundation.
Mm-hmm. Right, well, there's no other reference. Sorry, I haven't completed the notes, but in the handwritten notes there, so far, there's no specific reference to other injuries related to stamping.
Or any injuries to her back, Mr. Crawford?
No, there's not.
Nothing, okay.
The immediate discharge, again, there's a principal diagnosis in the immediate discharge of concussion/muscular pain, but it's not specified. sorry, these notes go on. I'm still on the same set.
They are quite lengthy, but
Yes,
you will see
I'll-
that many pages have been
Sure,
redacted
yes,
and
indeed.
are blank sheets.
Again, the only references so far have been in the history that's given, because on page 18, again, that history is repeated, which is what I would expect. It says that she was stamped on whilst on the ground. She punched to the back of head, collapsed, stamped on whilst on the ground.
And that's part of the history, but
That's
what
the
we're really
history.
looking for, and what I
Yeah.
would invite you to focus on,
Yeah,
Mr
Mr.
Crawford,
Right.
are any references to injuries, bruising, tenderness, anything that's consistent with the stamps that you saw demonstrated yesterday.
I have seen these notes before, and I know that that there was no specific
All right.
evidence of physical injuries, to the back of the spine.
Very well. If you've seen them before and that's your recollection, are you content that we move
Yes,
on?
I'm happy to accept that. Yes.
I'd like to take you now to a report prepared by a professional colleague of yours, Mr. Ian Anderson. He examined Nicole Short on the 21st of May of 2015, and I think, in fact, you had sight of his report at the time that you prepared your own report.
I had, yes.
And I will ask that we bring this up on the screen, please. It's Perk 1405. And if we scroll down, we will see that this is indeed the report prepared by Mr. Anderson on the 21st of May. And as I mentioned a moment ago, he examined Nicole Short on that date and gave evidence to that effect yesterday. I'd like to take you very briefly, Mr. Crawford, to three very short entries. Firstly, on page 6, fourth paragraph down on page 6. This is page 6 of the report. The PDF might have an additional page in. I think it must be page 7 on the PDF, Miss Welkers. There we are. Exactly. She described ongoing troublesome symptoms of headache together with neck discomfort and stiffness. She described discomfort and tenderness over the right side of her torso. So that's the history that she gave to Mr. Anderson. Then on page 7, please, or the next page, about 5 paragraphs down, beginning no residual. There we are. No residual bruising was noted on either side of her rib cage, but localized tenderness was noted over the outer aspect of the right side of her lower rib cage.
Auscultation.
Thank you. I was about to ask for your help with that word. Of her chest using a stethoscope revealed normal breath sounds. And onto the next page again, please, for the final entry. So that was from Mr. Anderson's examination, and this section is his opinion. And we see at the bottom of the screen there, just there's perfect, thank you. She suffered contusions to the right side of her torso, particularly over her lower right rib cage, consistent with having been caused by blunt injury. So you've heard there from Mr. Anderson's report the history that he took insofar as it's relevant to issues concerning the back, his findings on examination, and his opinion. Now, Mr. Anderson gave evidence yesterday, Mr. Crawford, and in his evidence he said that he did not consider that his findings on examination on the 21st of May were consistent with a stamp to the lower back or kidney area as demonstrated by Constable Walker and Constable Tomlinson. Would you wish to disagree with him?
I would say that tenderness over the right lower rib cage is consistent with having been caused by blunt injury. And I would say that could be, in my view, is also consistent with that blunt injury being a stamp or a blow to the right lower chest. There is uncertainty as to exactly exactly, well, A, whether this occurred, B, if it did occur, exactly where. It's not just the back. It's the suggestions that it could be, it's the back area, which includes the right lower chest. And that, in my view, could be consistent, or would also be consistent, with a stamp to the right lower chest, injuring the ribs. And this is the 21st of May, which is a couple of weeks after the incident, I think, thereabouts. And so there's definitely that. To me, that's evidence of an injury there, and that would be consistent with a stamp.
Evidence of an injury there, consistent with a stamp. But would it be consistent, in your opinion, Mr. Crawford, with the stamps demonstrated by Constable Walker and Constable Tomlinson?
I have reservations about the interpretation of that in terms of the potential severity of injury that actually occurs, because quite clearly the demonstration is impressive of a severe force and a serious mechanism of injury. However, there are other variables in this situation. Not every person who's stamped on sustains serious injuries, even if the stamps occur with apparent force. So I'm not sure how I can answer that question more accurately, because there are patients who can have an apparent stamp like that, but not sustain a serious injury or a life-threatening injury. And this is a couple of weeks down the line.
So should we understand then that you disagree with Mr. Anderson, who had the benefit of examining the patient, which is a benefit that you did not have?
Well, I disagree to the extent that I do agree to the extent that she didn't have any signs of a serious injury having been sustained. But my concern is that you could not exclude a stamp injury based on that alone, because there is no other there doesn't appear to be another explanation offered for that injury, or other injuries that she may have sustained.
Well, Mr. Crawford, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think yesterday in your evidence you accepted that pain to the right side could have been caused by her lying on her right side, curled up on top of her utility belt and CS spray, and could also have been caused by her falling to the ground.
Well, if I remember correctly, I didn't. Well, if she had fallen on the ground onto her right side, it could have caused that. I think when you asked me that question yesterday, you specifically included pain around the hip areas, which you were saying could that be caused by lying or contact with the spray, and the answer to that was yes. However, I do recollect, and I saw it in the notes there, that she actually had removed her spray from her utility belt, and it's not certain whether it was actually in the utility belt at the time she fell. And that's for the chair.
Mr. Chair,
yes.
Mr. Crawford, these are very much matters within the province, the exclusive province, if I may finish,
okay.
Of the chair. And it may be that the evidence that he heard was that, in fact, the casing was still on the belt and the cava. The spray itself had been
sorry,
removed.
I accept that, and I don't want to stray. But when I was considering mechanisms of injury, I'm considering these factors as to how the injury was caused, because if it's there or it's not there, would have an influence on whether or not an injury was sustained by that. That was all. Sorry.
It's a matter for the chair to consider the cause of various injuries, and really my focus this morning is very, very narrow, and it's to explore with you whether there are any entries in any of the records that are consistent with the stamps as demonstrated by Constable Tomlinson and Constable Walker. And that's what I'm interested, because that, I think, will assist the chair. So we should understand then that you disagree with Mr. Anderson to the extent that you consider that the contusions to the right side of the torso may have been caused or may be consistent with a stamping injury. And that's notwithstanding the fact that the first relevant entry appears to be on the 21st of May of 2015, and that there appear to be no relevant entries or history whatsoever prior to that date.
I feel you're trying to lead me down a path that is very strict and narrow, and looking for a yes or a no answer. Medicine is very rarely like that, and you can, and in the presence of a history of being stamped on, that type of injury would be consistent with that. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that it did or it did not happen. In the absence of a history, or in the evidence that it did not happen, sorry, I'm getting myself confused. You said in the manner demonstrated. There is sufficient uncertainty in my mind between a demonstration and a real-life situation for me to say, oh no, it is not consistent with that, because the mechanism is stamping, and it would be consistent with a stamp, and with an apparent stamp, or a stamp of apparent severe force, but she has. I absolutely accept that she has not got physical evidence of injuries of a significant or serious injury caused by a stamp. But she, as I said before, she was wearing protective gear, and there are other factors that could affect the severity of the injuries that occur as a result of a mechanism like that.
Can I take you to your inquiry statement, please, in conclusion of your evidence? That's SPBI. Oh, we have it, thank you. So this is the statement that you gave to a member of the inquiry team on the 12th of May of 2022. And can I take you to page 10, paragraph 41? And to put this in context, you were provided with the description of the stamp by Constable Tomlinson. You weren't provided with the description by Constable Walker, although they were quite similar. And of course, you weren't provided with the demonstrations because they hadn't happened yet. But having been provided with the description, you were asked if you would expect the doctors examining Nicole Short to discover any visible injuries on her back or side in A&E on the 3rd or 4th of May, when she saw the FME and when she saw her GP on the 5th of May. If we scroll down to the next paragraph, you say, clearly PC Short didn't have broken ribs, punctured lungs, internal bleeding and things like that. If it happened, she would have had bruising, straining, soft tissue injuries. You may feel it at the time or may not feel it at the time. You might not be aware of the pain or injury, but only later, all the adrenaline and things wear off. Over a period of time, because muscles and tissues suffer microtrauma, they can stiffen up within a day, 2 days, 24 to 36 hours. That's when you get maximum symptoms, as the changes in the tissues cause that. A light injury could take several weeks, several days to a week or longer to settle. Severely bruised ribs or broken ribs can take 6 weeks or longer to get better. You would get stiffness. It would take several days to resolve. It depends on your level of fitness and what you're used to having. Can I ask you whether the paragraphs that I have read out to you just now remain your opinion today?
What I was trying to explain in that was that there is a spectrum or a range, and a range of severity, and you can go from a mild injury to a severe injury. But there are shades of grey in between as well, and it can vary, and it can be very difficult to predict just exactly how long symptoms would persist. You know, I also explained during that discussion that you know, there can be other causes for stiffness and soreness in muscles after extreme physical exertion. But in one way we're going from a general to a specific. I do fully accept that in this particular case there was no evidence of significant or severe injury to the body of Miss Short as a result of stamping. My opinion that was formed was based at on the reports and the statements that were given to me at the time, describing the mechanism of injury and describing, you know, her symptoms and clinical presentation, that to me at that time in those statements was consistent with a stamping injury.
Bear with me a moment, please, Mr. Crawford. I'm grateful for your time. I've no further questions for you.
Thank you.
Are there any Rule 9 applications? Dr Crawford, I wonder if you would retire to the witness room while I hear a submission.
So I wonder if I could have a few minutes to consider that. A Rule 9.
Yes, very well. Do you want me to adjourn then? I'll adjourn for a short time to allow that. Now, Ms McCall, do you have an application?
No, thank you, sir.
Ms Mitchell, would you come to the table, please? Yes.
The issue one is in relation to breathing and Nicole Short's breathing. Yesterday, there was evidence given by this witness where he said in the information that he was provided with, there were various places where Ms Short did complain of being unable to breathe. And he explained that he thought that would be consistent with having a blow in that area where she was unable to breathe because of an injury to the ear, possibly having been winded, or an injury causing pain that was restricting breathing. Now, I didn't propose to take them through a possible other mechanism for the pain injury at the side because my learned friend's already done that, but I was going to ask him to look at PERC statement 253, which is the statement of Nicole Short, page 3 thereof, because Nicole Short says in her interaction with Sheikh Ubayo, before there's any question of any contact between the two, she said, "I was in terror and fear of my life. I just turned away and tried to run. I remember screaming no and crying, but no tears were coming out and struggling to breathe." So I would like to take the witness to that part of the statement where he can see that the symptom, the breathlessness symptom, predates any suggestion of a punch or a stamp. And then simply identifying in the emergency accident emergency records, which he records in his own report at page 7 of 26 at subsection 3, that the witness's breathing was 16 breaths per minute as being recorded. And just to confirm with him, that's within the normal range. So just to...
That's the only matter.
No, there's one other matter, and the second matter is on the issue of Crown instruction and how the report was obtained, the information given. I'll give it in more detail, my Lord, but the information given. And the reason for that, my Lord, is the inquiry will, of course, understand that part of the inquiry terms, whilst not specifically relevant to this part of the hearing, is to examine the post-incident management process and the investigation up to but not including the making of the Lord Advocate of the prosecutorial decision communicated to the family. And it also says in brackets, and the victim's right to review process that was undertaken by the Crown Council in 2019, including 1, the effectiveness of procedures for gathering and analysing information, etc. In this particular report, what I would like to deal with this witness is some restrictions in the report. For example, the methodology, the questions that were asked and the broadness of those questions, the documentation, just to check that he didn't receive any information on audio such as airwaves, he was given some visuals only, and very importantly, in light of the evidence that he has given about the mechanisms of energy and efficacy and whether or not something was an assault which was severe and most effective, whether or not he was given any information on Mr. Sheikh Ubayo himself, because it doesn't appear from the documentation that that happened. And then take him to the fact that there doesn't appear to be any discussions, as was explored in evidence, about outdoor shoes or the vest or repeated stamps, or again the height, weight or fitness of Mr. Sheikh Ubayo, and to ask him about the part of his statement where he says, "I don't think I was questioned in the report. It's very common for solicitors to seek clarification of certain points or if there are any factual inaccuracies," and ask whether or not he can recall anyone from Crown Office coming back to him to ask him about any of these things. And
Thank
those
you.
would be my questions.
Thank you. In relation to the first issue, it seems to me that I will have all that evidence available to me, and I don't consider it would assist for this to be further explored with this witness. It can be addressed in closing submissions in relation to the whole evidence. In relation to the second matter, that's really a matter for the later hearing, and I don't want to embark on that with this witness at this stage. It may be that the exploration of that issue by the inquiry will lead it back to this witness, but I wouldn't wish to explore that with him at this stage. So I shall not allow any questioning further of this witness.
I'm obliged. I'm obviously obliged that the court indicating that at some future point this may need to be revisited. The question of the family's contact with the Crown and the VRR and what the Crown did thereafter is obviously a critical issue. So,
well, it's a matter. The whole conduct of the Crown is a matter of great interest to the inquiry. Thank you. Could we have the witness back now, please? Dr Crawford, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. I'm going to rise very briefly so that the next witness can be brought in, and when that happens, you'll be free to go.
Thank you very much.
Now, Miss Graham, who's the next witness?
The next witness is Ms. Jane Combe.
Good morning, Miss Combe.
Good morning.
Would you take the oath, please, if you raise your hand? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Graham.
Thank you. Good morning. Is it Miss Combe or Miss Combe?
Combe.
Combe. Thank you. I'll try to get that right throughout. As everyone here knows, I have an issue with names at times. You're a former police inspector.
I am
And what age are you?
52.
And you've been retired from the police force, as I understand it, for about 3 years?
That's correct.
Is that right? But when you were working, you worked mainly in Fife.
I did.
And you had various inspector roles. You were first promoted to inspector in 2010. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you were posted to Kirkcaldy Police Office at that time?
Yes.
Good. Thank you. Now, all of your contact details are known to the inquiry, so we won't ask you to say those here. What I want to do first of all is to make sure that you've got everything you might need in front of you. So as we go through your evidence, you've got hard copies. So you can see the black folder, and I'll take you through what should be in there. So when I'm maybe referring to a paragraph or a particular section, it should come up on the screen in front of you. And so we'll be able to see maybe a paragraph. But if you want to look around that, you've got the hard copy, and you please refer to it.
Okay, thank you.
And at any time, if you wish to refer me to something that you'd like to speak to, let me know and I can get that brought up on the screen as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is PERC 190, which I believe is an operational statement dated the 15th of May 2015. And if that can be brought up on the screen, we'll see your name, and the date it was taken was the 15th of May 2015 at 9 in the morning, and it says self. So you prepared this yourself?
I did.
And this was after the events of the 3rd of May 2015?
Yes.
And you prepared this in Cowdenbeath. Were you based in Cowdenbeath at the time?
Yes, that's where I was stationed at the time.
Right. And were you doing your best on the 15th of May to give a true and accurate record of what you'd done on the 3rd of May?
Yes.
Thank you. And can we look at paragraph 66 of your inquiry statement, or we'll look at the first page first. We'll see this is your inquiry statement. It was taken by a member of the team on the 22nd of March this year.
Yes.
And then if we can look at paragraph 66. You see, my operational statement, which is the one we were looking at a moment ago, 15th of May, would be the one that's most clear, and I stand by that because I gave that shortly after the event.
That's correct.
So this was the first statement prepared by you after the events of the 3rd of May.
Yes.
And then can we look at the end of the inquiry statement? The last paragraph's paragraph 125. And it says, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. And in light of that, you signed the pages of this inquiry statement.
I did.
And although on the screen you'll see it's redacted, I believe the hard copy you have should have your electronic signature.
Yes, on all pages.
Thank you. And that was signed by you on the 18th of May
Yes.
this year.
Yes.
Thanks. And then can we also confirm that you were doing your best when you gave this statement to the inquiry to be truthful and accurate in everything you mentioned?
Yes.
And then can we look at a statement dated the 8th of March 2018? So this is almost 3 years after the events, and this is PERC 191. Again, at the top we should see your name. We can just see your name, Jane, there we are. And then we see it's dated the 8th of March 2018, 10:10 hours, and it was noted by Investigating Officer Neil Duncan, and the place was at Cooper. Were you based at Cooper by 2018?
I was, yes.
Thank you. And again, when you gave this statement, was this to PERC, Police Information and Review Commission
Yes.
officers? And you're doing your best, again, 3 years later, to give a true and accurate record of what you'd done
Yes.
on the 3rd of May 2015. Can we look at paragraphs in your inquiry statement again, please? 65, 66 and 67. Let's start with 65. And you're talking about the different statements that you've given. And you say the second was taken by PERC, who interviewed me on the 8th of March 2018. They came to see me at Cooper and I told them the truth. And then in paragraph 66, which we looked at a moment ago, you say my PERC statement will be less clear. Likewise, my later statement provided given the passage of time. In 2018, my recollection of that incident will be the same as it is now. By clear, I mean my recollection would not be affected by what I've seen in the media, particularly the Panorama programme and media reporting. So it's something that you've kept an eye on in the media or been aware
Yes.
of. Yeah. And then paragraph 67. The content of both statements are exactly the same, other than the addition in the PERC statement regarding the contact with the Force Medical Examiner, the FME. I don't see any difference in the content of my first statement and my second statement. The only addendum they've put in there is the contact with the FME, and if I could remember any conversation with Nicole Short, I don't think there's any other difference. If there is a difference, I stand by my operational statement because it was produced closer to the time. I know to help the chair, really it's the operational statement, the first statement, that you think is clearer and the most accurate.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you. So if the chair thinks there's any difference between later statements or your inquiry statement or even your evidence today, if there's a difference between what you've said and your first statement, he should prefer your first one.
Yes.
Thank you. Lovely. Can I also ask you about paragraph 68 of your inquiry statement? And you say, I've also been interviewed numerous times as well by the officers working on behalf of the police officers. A Mr. John Salins and somebody else as well during COVID, they've also been in contact. So I've given a statement, it's the same statement and I've never changed it. So we've heard the name of John Salins previously from others. Do you know who Mr. Salins is?
No, I know that he was working obviously on behalf of the solicitors for the police officers, but I don't know.
Right. And when did you give him a statement or speak to him?
That was just when COVID began, so probably about March 2020.
Yeah. So
About
that's
that
roughly
time.
when we went into lockdown, round
Yes,
about that
just
time.
at lockdown.
Just then. And do you know what happened to that statement?
No.
But that was a later statement than your original operational statement and your PERC statement?
Yes.
Thank you. And what sort of things was he asking you about at that time in 2020?
Just exactly the same. Can I recall what happened on that day? Did I have any conversations with the officers? Did I have any conversation with Nicole Short? And that's what I could remember from him.
All right. Thank you. Do you still have a copy of that statement, or was that only in the hands of Mr. Salins?
Mr. Sallin's statement, no, it was dictated and then they took that to be typed up, but I've never seen that statement.
Right. Thank you. And you also talk about being interviewed numerous times. Were there other people who interviewed you?
No, I think it was just Mr. Salins. I went into police headquarters and then he was in contact via telephone, so that's what I mean by numerous times, but it was the same person about the same statement.
So PERC interviewed you, the inquiry team have interviewed you,
Yes.
and Mr. Salins has spoken to you
Yes.
as well. Thank you. And that he spoke to you, you said, at police headquarters. Is that
Sorry,
it?
at Glenrothes Police Headquarters,
Oh.
Fife Division Police Headquarters.
Fife Division Police Headquarters. And again, that's where you were based.
No, I was retired by that time.
Oh, I
There
see.
was an arrangement for me to go in.
Thank you. So, are you happy you've got everything that you would need in front of you
Yes,
today?
thank you.
Good. Can I ask you about paragraphs 37 to 47 about your in your inquiry statement? And the chair can read through all of these paragraphs himself, but you're talking here about police culture and what it was to you and how it's changed over the years. And you talk about it being very different in 1991 to how it is today. And I think I'm very interested in your impressions of police culture in 2015.
It depends on what you mean by police culture. I mean, I was asked that question. I didn't evoke that. I didn't
No,
say I want to
no.
speak about that. So I was asked about police culture, and for me, it's just the parameters of an organisation, what we work within, and what we think is acceptable. We're obviously different from the fire service, the police, education, but it has changed, and we are evolving all the time.
Right. Can we move the screen up then and just have a look? So you've talked about the difference between working in a more urban area like Kirkcaldy, where there are more officers and maybe more violence, compared to someone maybe in more of a rural area.
Yes.
And is that the sort of thing that can make a difference to culture and the way police officers act in a police station?
No, not necessarily, because every police officer should deal with the situation as they find them on that time.
All right. And you've said at paragraph 40, compared to somebody up in St Andrews or Cooper, where I actually started my service, you had to take a different approach because your backup was maybe 10, 15 miles away.
Yep.
Whereas in Kirkcaldy, if required and appropriate, officers could take a more robust approach. However, officers should always adopt a policing style relevant to the situation. And so is this an issue about the support available and how close or how
Yes.
much time it would take
Yes.
for officers to have backup and support?
Yes.
Less immediate in a rural area, more immediate in an urban area.
Yes.
Is that
That's
fair to say?
my experience.
But as you say, every policing style or every tactical option adopted by a police officer will depend on the particular circumstances that they're faced with.
Yes.
And then you talk at paragraph 41 about not advocating arresting individuals in a large crowd, and it can escalate a situation. Is that something that you were always conscious of, not to escalate situations or make them worse, but
Yes.
is de-escalating situations something that officers consider on a regular basis?
On a daily basis.
What does it mean to you to de-escalate a situation? How would you achieve that?
Well, obviously the example I was asked and I was given was in a football crowd. You wouldn't go in and arrest someone there because you put the officers more at risk and the public. So you would take an appropriate time where if that was them leaving the stadium, or if you knew their identity, you could get them at a later date. And obviously if that was a domestic situation, you would try and separate both parties. So officers have a lot of things in their toolkit they can use to de-escalate, communication being the priority one.
So officers can bide their time,
Yes.
pick their moment, depending on the circumstances when it's appropriate.
Yes.
And they can communicate. We've heard a lot of evidence from officers talking about your voice is actually a tool in your armoury,
Yes.
that you can always be trying to communicate with people. And that can be an effective technique for de-escalating a situation.
Yes.
And you'd agree with that?
100%.
Thank you. And then if we move up the screen, you talk about at paragraph 42, talking about negotiation tactics and talking people down. Is that what you mean by de-escalating?
Yes.
Right. And you say 43, I would expect any officer to adopt a tactic correct for the situation they are faced with. But the location can be an important factor in that.
It can be.
So you've talked about football stadiums, a lot of fans present. You've talked about urban areas, rural areas. It can be an important factor.
Yes.
We've heard evidence from a number of people about the national decision-making model. Is that something you were aware of before you retired?
Yes.
And we've heard that you're feeding in new information about all the circumstances, and that could include things like location and the
Yes.
incident, and then you're working out your tactical options, and the more information, the new information you get in, you review. Is that the type
Yes.
of thing that you're doing all
Yes.
the time? Thank you. And you then, at paragraph 44, talk about in an urban area, assistance is more readily available. And again, that's about the level of support that may be available to officers at any time.
Yes.
Thank you. And then looking further down, you again repeat it's the situation you're faced with, and you have mentioned Alan Smith. We've heard from PC Smith, and you were aware of him.
Yes, he was one of my officers.
Right. So you were actually his inspector, were you?
No, I think he was his sergeant at that time.
All right. And we've heard from PC Smith that he was a trainer and first aid trained, and the chair's heard his evidence. So, and then 47, you've also had the benefit of working in London alongside the Met.
I did, yes.
And so that's a very built up and urban area. It's quite different again from Kirkcaldy.
Yeah.
And you've talked there about officers cannot afford to alienate themselves because potentially they could have their property damaged. Can I just ask you about that paragraph?
The point I think I was trying to make there is that it's a very different policing style. Certainly in Fife Division, when I was there, the officers actually live in the community, so they're actually part of the community. So the approach that I have witnessed down in the Metropolitan Police or some of the larger police forces down south was a different style of policing, in my opinion.
I would imagine, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, that in London you could maybe meet someone 1 year and not see them again.
Yes.
For many years, if at all.
Yes.
But maybe that is less likely to happen in a town like Kirkcaldy.
Yes.
Thank you. And that may also be a factor in how you police the community.
Yes.
And we've heard some evidence about how important it is for the police to have support from the community and engagement with the community
Yes.
in which they are working. Can I ask you about paragraph 48, please? You've been asked a number of questions about race, and you've said you've never heard any of the officers subject to this inquiry saying anything with a racial overtone. And I'm interested in whether you've ever seen or heard anything from any of the officers with a racial undertone.
No.
No. So it both overtones and
Yes.
not just blatant things,
Yeah.
but maybe more subtle
Yeah,
things.
nothing.
You've not seen anything like that.
No.
And do you think that officers would tone things down if they're in the presence of an inspector? That's a senior rank in the police?
Potentially, but when you're walking about the corridors, you can overhear conversations you maybe shouldn't overhear.
And partly, I would imagine, as an inspector, your job is to be aware of what's happening
Yes.
with your team. Now, I think you've said at 49, you've worked in the Alcohol and Violence Reduction Unit.
Yes.
And your role was to engage with all communities.
Yes.
And I'm interested in what engagement over the years you had with the black community, if I can phrase it that way.
There wasn't a large black community in Kirkcaldy or actually in Fife, but they were part of the larger ethnic minority. So we went to open days, seminars, mosque visits, engagement with youths, having some of the ethnic minority youths come into the police station. So we actually worked quite closely with them.
And can you tell me, sort of roughly, when was it you were working with all these communities?
That would be 2014 to 2018, about that time.
And when you say you were visiting and having open days and attending
Yes.
those, how big a part of your role at that time was visiting with communities and attending events?
It was quite a large part of that role.
Would you be able to assist the chair and say how regular those visits were? Was it weekly or was it monthly?
It actually depended on what events they were actually arranging, because we were invited along as guests, so it was dictated by the communities when the police were actually invited as guests to that. And then obviously if there was any community messages that were needed to be put out, we also did that. Latterly we had a really good system in Fife where we could actually just send an email. I think there was always this mystique that we always had to go on prayer day on a Friday, but we actually engaged with the community and they said that wasn't appropriate. They felt they were businessmen, they went to prayers, they wanted to get away, so it was hindering them. So we actually listened to the community and we were able to put out this messaging service that we used quite readily in Fife.
So that was through better communication?
Yes, listen to the community.
And then adapting your approach to suit the messages that you were getting from the community.
Yes.
And you've talked about a community message on a Friday. Can you just explain what that is?
Well, for example, if Police Scotland or the wider police community wanted to put a message out for security, that would be a letter or something from the Chief Constable to be delivered. So we would have to do that, but that was only if and when it was required.
Was that a personal visit by you with the message?
No, as I said, they didn't want that person. They said, yes, by all means you can come in, you're welcome, but they were actually quite happy then to get that as a leaflet drop.
A leaflet drop or
Yes.
emails you mentioned
Yes.
as well. And you've said you were quite close to the black community, so small as it was. Can you tell me about your connection with the black community?
Well, they obviously had what we called Free Fife, and we actually had some of the members of Free Fife would actually come in and assist us with some police inputs.
We've heard very limited evidence about Free Fife. It has been mentioned to the chair. Could you tell us a bit more about it and the experience you had?
The experience I had was that they were sort of an interface, if you want to call that, with the ethnic community. So they had the relationship with the police. If they had any issues, they could come to us and ask about things like that.
Well, tell me about the organisation itself. Did it have people in charge or leaders or
From my knowledge, I'm not an expert on Free Fife. I think it was like trustees, and they had like a manager, and then had volunteers who worked with them. But I'd say I can't give comment on it because I don't exactly know how they were structured.
I'm only interested in your impression at the time. But you did have contact with them. Thank you. And were you aware at that time about any concerns that the black community had or Free Fife had about policing of black people in Kirkcaldy?
No, the concerns they had were the same as any of the communities in Fife, was the time police took to respond, the lack of communication that we gave them. So that was across all communities in Fife. That wasn't just with our black communities. But they did have concerns, but as I said, there was nothing just specifically to them.
Can you remember now what the concerns were about communication with Police Scotland? Was there anything specific that you can remember?
No, nothing specific.
And do you obviously personally had a lot of contact?
Yes.
What about other officers in Kirkcaldy? Did they have contact with the black community or with Free Fight?
It wouldn't be unless it was their specialism, but a lot of the community officers, as part of their role, if the meeting or the event was when they were on duty, they would go, and to their credit, a lot of officers actually went to these events actually off duty.
Right. And can you explain what is a community officer compared to an ordinary police constable, if I can say a non-community officer?
I would explain it as a community officer has responsibility for a certain area, so they could build up that rapport, whether it's business or the schools, whereas a response officer doesn't have that luxury, if you want to call it that, and they have to respond to all the incidents coming in, whereas a community officer, usually they can put things in their diary, so they have more time to spend on an incident.
And so that's the distinction there, the response officer and the community officer.
Yes.
And is a community officer based in a particular location for longer to allow them to build a rapport?
Usually.
So a response officer may be moved about.
Yes.
And paragraph 50, please. You've talked about, following the tragic incident, there were concerns that there could be a negative and adverse reaction from the ethnic minority community in Fife and a breakdown in our engagement with these communities, which could manifest in demonstration and protest. However, due to the continued position, community engagement and dialogue, this was avoided.
I think I should read positive.
Positive community engagement. Thank you. So we can amend that. So due to the continued positive community engagement and dialogue, this was avoided. Meetings took place with community leaders where any concerns could be addressed and discussed. I'd like to ask you about this paragraph. So what was the continued positive community engagement that you're referring to?
Well, after the event, there was actually a meeting which was chaired, and all the community leaders were invited to come to that meeting to see if they had any concerns that they wanted to raise.
And do you remember now when that meeting took place?
No, I couldn't give you a date, but it was quite close after the incident.
So sometime after the 3rd of May 2015?
Yes. I would say it would be in May, no later than June, but I couldn't give you a date, sorry.
Right. Where did that meeting take place?
In I think it's still called Dunnacare House Hotel in Kirkcaldy.
Right. Is that in the centre of Kirkcaldy?
On the outskirts.
On the outskirts. And then who was it that arranged that meeting?
I don't know who arranged it, but it would be somebody from the management team in police in Fife Division.
So it was Police Scotland that
Yes.
that arranged it. And
Yes.
were you present at
Yes.
that meeting? And you've talked about community leaders being invited. Tell me who was invited.
I couldn't give you a list of who was invited, but it would be the imam, business owners, anyone who had, I would say, influence in the community, so members of Free Fife, Fife Equality, they would have a representation there as well.
So someone in Police Scotland, we may be able to get more information about this.
Possibly,
Someone
yeah.
in Police Scotland would have selected a list of people
Or
to invite.
the invite would go out and then they would respond who would come.
Right. Was it invitation only, or was it a meeting open to all?
I can't recall.
So was it advertised in any way more publicly?
I don't know.
And who was responsible, if you know, or if you don't know, tell me, who was responsible for selecting the invitees?
I don't know.
Right. And do you know anything about how they were identified?
No.
No. And do you remember what concerns, if any, were addressed or discussed at that meeting?
No.
Not now. And it may be the view that the idea of community leaders as an amorphous body, if you like, is quite an outdated view of how to engage with a community such as the black community. That there are no longer community leaders as such. Do you have any views on that at all?
No, I think going back to 2015, you've got to use what communication you have. And for the police, that was our method of communicating with them. But I do recall there were some very young men at that meeting. And I said, so they wouldn't be the leaders, so they were obviously there as part of the community, because with the age group of them, they couldn't have been the community leaders.
So it's not that you excluded all apart from the community leaders.
No.
There were other younger people
No.
present as well.
So I think what I'm trying to get over there, the invite would go to the community leaders, and then they would actually publicise this meeting, and they would bring along with them who they would bring along.
So they would disseminate information more
Yes.
widely amongst
Yes.
the people they knew
Yes.
or the groups they had contact with. And do you remember, you've said there that concerns could be addressed and discussed. Do you remember if there were, you know, we hear about action points after meetings where people go and resolve things that have been raised, concerns that have been raised? Do you remember if there were any action points?
No, not after this length of time, sorry.
No. And you've, as part of the, can we go up slightly? Paragraph 51. I've been asked if I know why there was not any kind of reaction from the community to the Sheku Bio incident as I've described. My own perception is because the local community trusted the police. There wasn't the perception of a big cover-up by the police in Kirkcaldy or Police Scotland. And that was your perception
That's
at the
my
time.
perception, yes.
And that was based on the contact you'd had with the community.
And the
through
fact
your
there was no
work.
demonstrations or protests, bar one that I'm aware of.
What was the one you're aware of?
When the family had come to Kirkcaldy Police Station. But that, for me, was very peaceful, very dignified, more like a vigil opposed to a demonstration.
Right. So, and that was organised by the family.
I believe so.
You said more of a vigil.
Yes, there was no hostility. It wouldn't be a demonstration. I would class as a demonstration.
So when we're thinking about any reaction from the community, or in particular from the family, it wasn't any sort of noisy,
No.
difficult demonstration. Was that at Kirkcaldy Police Office?
Yes.
And you've said the local community trusted the police.
Yes.
Was that the local black community?
All community.
All the community?
Yes.
Can we look at paragraphs 52, first of all, and 53? 52, when I was in the job, I was the type of person, if I thought somebody had done something wrong, I would stand up and say it. I was never one of those ones who wouldn't. I say it how it was and wasn't frightened of that. I've challenged senior officers at times, so if there was something that was wrong, I would say it was wrong. I wasn't frightened of that. I wasn't frightened of my organisation. There was sexism and things like that, but as I say, as far as officers under my command being really racist, no, never saw that. Sexism, homophobia, yeah, definitely there was that, there were issues. 53, I've been asked if there was sexism and homophobia, would I be expecting also for there to be racism? I'm not saying I wouldn't expect that. I'm not saying that that didn't exist in Fife Constabulary or Police Scotland officers, but I'm not naive enough to say that. Did I witness anybody being treated differently because of race? No. Did I witness somebody different because they were gay or lesbian? Yes, I did witness that. If they were a female, were they treated differently? Yes, I did witness that. Can I ask you a couple of more questions about this?
Yes.
So paragraph 52, first of all. You're talking about being willing to stand up and say something and challenge. We've heard evidence about the ranks of officers and the hierarchy, and I've asked other officers about did they feel uncomfortable maybe challenging a more senior officer or a more experienced officer. And you're, as I understand your statement, you're saying you weren't
No.
shy to do that.
No.
It must have taken quite a lot of courage to do that, however.
If it was the right thing to do, it was the right thing to do.
Right. So you had that courage to speak up.
Yes.
And you've said that you had seen issues of racism and homophobia.
No, not racism.
Oh, sorry. Sexism and homophobia. And had you had cause to challenge that type of behaviour?
Yes, you're going back to when I first joined the job. That's the point I'm making. It's a total different organisation than it was in 1991.
So that's examples from the early 90s?
Yes.
Not from 2015?
No, very few now in 2015.
Very few?
Yeah, we have open officers who are openly gay. That would never have happened in 1991.
I see. And we've heard that there were women working in Kirkcaldy Police Office in 2015.
A lot now.
And a lot, even more now maybe.
Yes.
We have heard evidence that there were no black officers in Kirkcaldy in 2015.
Not in Kirkcaldy.
No. Do you remember them anywhere else?
there was one black officer who worked in the west of Fife, but I couldn't give you his date of joining.
Right. And when you say the west of Fife, what?
Dunfermline, Dunfermline,
Oh,
Cowdenbeath.
Dunfermline. Right. Do you remember his name?
Yes, I need to. It's,
No, you don't. You don't need to say it out loud if you don't want to. So there was one in Dunfermline. Anywhere else in Fife?
Yes, we've got a senior ranking officer who started her service in Fife as well, who's a black officer.
And where was she based?
She moved about, so I don't know where she would be in 2015.
Right. Okay. So these examples that you had come across of sexism and homophobia were in the early 90s?
Yeah.
But you've used the phrase there, let me just see if I can find it, really racist, I think. I saw that somewhere. Second bottom line in 52. There was sexism and things like that, but as I say, as far as officers under my command being really racist, no, never saw that. So under your command, you've said you were an inspector from 2010.
Yes.
So is that when you began to command officers at that stage?
You could say you started that as a sergeant or even a senior officer, but if you're talking about middle management, that would be 2010.
That'd be 2010. So we're looking at a period from 2010, and you say, as far as officers under my command being really racist, no, I never saw that. What do you mean?
I don't know what I mean by really racist. I don't know if that's a typing error. Really racist, don't know.
Well, we can check that because
Yeah.
we've got recordings, obviously, of all these things. So looking at it now, do you understand what you, if you did say that, do you
No.
understand what you meant?
No, just racist, full stop,
Yeah.
being racist.
And can you remember any examples when you were commanding officers of racism, whether overt or covert?
No, none.
Or nothing like that?
No.
But you do say, you're not suggesting that it didn't exist in Fife Constabulary. You're not naive enough to say that. So you're not suggesting that Kirkcaldy Police Office was a haven of equality.
Utopia, no.
Yeah. Thank you. Can I ask you about paragraph 55, please? You were asked about the media, and you say that when it was Fife Constabulary, so this is before it became Police Scotland.
Yes.
The local inspector could be expected to speak to the local reporter, local radio, but then when we went to Police Scotland, everything went through a media department.
Yes.
And so the handling or engagement with the media became centralised
Yes.
after April 2013.
Yes.
And you say if a reporter arrived looking for a comment at an incident, the correct procedure would be to direct them to the media department. And you say I'd be really surprised if a reporter would phone the station. They would just be directed to the police press office. They would know that. So is that what the centralised department was called, the police press office?
Media department, yeah.
The media department. Now, what about people who'd obviously worked for Fife Constabulary prior to it becoming Police Scotland? They'd maybe built up good relationships, professional working relationships with members of the press. And would that contact continue even after the media department was put in place?
Not to my knowledge.
Not to your knowledge. So although you've talked about, you were obviously an inspector prior to 2013,
Yes.
when it became Police Scotland, and you'd been expected as part of that role to have that engagement with the media. After April 2013, did you continue to have any engagement with the media yourself?
I did have engagement with the media, but it came through our media department. It was arranged and authorised by them.
So it was all done through that media department after that?
Yes.
And was that part of the sort of rules that you were supposed to abide by?
It was just a process that made it easy for everyone, that we knew what the parameters were.
And it relieved you of that burden
Yes.
of engaging?
Yes.
When you had, no doubt, other duties. Can I ask you to look at paragraph 70, please? And then we move on here to the 3rd of May 2015. And you've been asked if you had a line manager or a senior officer giving you orders on that date. And you say, I had the authority to deploy my officers where they were required. Now, can I ask you, on the 3rd of May, where were you based that day?
Cowden based.
And how many officers were under your command or you were in charge of?
On that day, or
Well, yes,
Oh.
or just in general. If
my
you
team
don't-
consisted of 2 sergeants and 13 officers.
Right. So the sergeants would be the more senior members
Yes.
of your team, and then the 13 officers. Did they form part of a response team and community
No.
officers? Or
No, they were a partnership, working in partnership with other partners, so they didn't fall either in community or response.
Oh, right. Can you tell me a little bit about their role?
Their role was to look at violence reduction, community engagement, and we also did youth diversion. And when there was antisocial behaviour, we could be deployed for a period of time to try and address those issues.
So that sounds like your team were involved in some big issues,
Yes, it could be. Could be.
not individual incidents, just
No.
bigger, broader issues for Police Scotland.
It could be.
And can you explain how you became involved with the Shekubio incident?
Well, I think as all inspectors on duty should be aware of all incidents that are ongoing. So from my recollection, I wouldn't have been working on the same radio channel, so I've picked that up from the storm incident.
Tell us about that.
Well, a storm incident is created when an incident is ongoing, and you can look at all the incidents that are happening in the area.
And when you were working in May 2015, is that something that you would regularly keep on top of?
Yes,
So you were aware of incidents going on in other police areas?
yes,
And that's how you became aware of the knife calls
Yes.
regarding Mr. Bio. And then can we look at paragraph 71? So you specifically say there that you were reading from the storm call cards. We've heard reference to call cards. So that's sort of a record, if you like.
yes, an incident
of
report.
An incident report. And you became aware of the calls from members of the public at that time. And can we then look at 72, 73? 73. I've been asked if it was of my own volition that I went to help and that nobody called and asked for support. Yes. From recollections, my instructions to my staff would be permission to use blue lights and sirens to get there. It was a serious incident. With blue lights and sirens, you could get to Kirkcaldy from Cowdenbeath in under 10 minutes, and I arrived around 8 a.m.
Yes,
So when you say you arrived, you say later in paragraph 74, I arrived in Kirkcaldy. Did you arrive to Hayfield, Kirkcaldy Police Office or Hayfield Road?
Kirkcaldy Police Office.
Thank you. So you were asked if you went of your own volition. And can you tell us a little bit more about your decision-making process to go and attend?
Well, I would stand by that was the right decision to do. It was a priority. It was a serious call where extra resources would have been needed. So that's where I took my resources. On that day, I only had 4 officers on.
All right. So that day you had 4 officers. Did you have 2 sergeants as
No,
well?
just myself.
Just yourself and 4 officers?
Yep.
Did they all go?
Yes,
So all 5 of you went?
yes,
And did you all go to Kirkcaldy Police Office?
yes.
And you said it was a serious call, a serious incident. Can you tell us what made you view it as a serious incident?
Well, the nature of the call, that it was a male brandishing a knife at members of the public in a public place.
Right. And your recollection is that he was brandishing a knife at members
That's my
of the
working
public?
assumption, yes. That's what was on the call card that I read.
When you say, can you look at paragraph 71, you use that phrase about a working assumption.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you could explain to the chair what that means in reality in terms of your day-to-day work.
I had no reason to doubt what the members of the public were phoning in about.
Were you weren't listening to the calls, were you? You said you got that from the storm car.
No, not at that time, but what I would do, my working practice would be then...
Sorry, could you stop for a second? That's fine. Sorry, I missed the first part of that answer.
I can't 100% say that I did on this day, but my working practice would have been, if I was going to an incident, would be then to put my radio onto the channel where that incident was.
Right. So it's drawn to your attention through
Yes.
the storm call cards.
Yes.
You could then, from your position,
Move on to that channel.
move on to the channel, and then listen to what was happening at the
Yes.
time. And we've heard about airwaves transmissions and the calls coming in. So you could actually listen into that.
Yes.
And take a view then about whether you were going to assist. So you arrived at Kirkcaldy Police Office at 8 a.m. You said that in paragraph 73. And in paragraph 74, you talk about arriving in Kirkcaldy and speaking to Inspector Stevie Kay in his office. And I would have asked, where do you want my resources deployed? And Inspector Kay would have given directions where they were to go. It's my recollection that I would deal with all other incidents requiring an inspector's oversight. So you've turned up with your team at about 8 o'clock and spoken to Inspector Kay.
Yes.
We've heard mention of Inspector Kay. Was he the person, a senior officer at Kirkcaldy Police Office that day?
Yeah, it was the same rank as myself. I don't know whether Inspector Kay would have actually been based at Kirkcaldy Police Station at that time or arrived there, because as a police assistant officer you could start at other stations, so I can't comment where he actually started his duty that day.
We've not heard from Inspector Kay yet, but we have heard that he may sometimes have been at Dunfermline, but on this particular day he was in Kirkcaldy.
Right. My recollection was I spoke to him in the inspector's office at Kirkcaldy Police Station
In the morning.
in the morning.
And you asked him, you say, I would have asked, where do you want my resources deployed? So that's a reference to you and your team.
Yes.
And do you remember now what his response was? What did he ask you and your officers to do?
No, I don't remember from the inquiry statement, but if I go back to my operational statement, I've obviously sent my 4 officers on to locus protection, so that
Right. So
would be
let's
what happened.
let's look at that for a moment. That's the 15th of May 2015 statement,
Yep.
PERC 190, and page 2 at the top. You talk about arriving at Kirkcaldy Police Office, contacting Duty Police Incident Office Inspector Kay, who requested my team carry out locus protection duties. My officers were thereafter duly deployed. So you essentially straight away sent your officers who were
Yes.
from your team to Hayfield Road.
Yes.
And just briefly for people listening in, do you mind telling us what locus protection duties are?
It would be where the incidents actually occurred, so we would have to secure that area.
So will they be helping with things like traffic duties and taping off areas and things like
Yes,
that?
yes. But once the location is secured, they shouldn't have to do any traffic duties because it should be a sterile area.
Right, so how do you secure an area?
But like just what you said, with tape or with an officer's presence.
All right, thank you. And then if we could go back to your inquiry statement, please, paragraphs 77 to 80. And let's say 77, you later learned that sadly Mr. Bio had died. Senior officers thereafter started to arrive at Kirkcaldy Police Office. They took control of this incident. My role thereafter was minimal. I was requested to act in a support role for Conrad Trickett. And we've heard mention of Conrad Trickett. Was he the post-incident manager?
He was.
And were you, in mentioning a support role, we may have heard from someone else that you were the deputy post-incident manager?
No,
Would
I wasn't the deputy post-incident manager. I was a liaison officer.
No. Can you explain the difference, please, between a deputy post-incident manager and a liaison officer?
I've never heard the term deputy post-incident manager. But if you were a deputy manager, you would have some degree of taking the notes, of actually carrying out, fulfilling that role of the post-incident manager. My role on that day, and I was very clear about that, was could I act in a support role for Mr. Trickett. So basically showing about Kirkcaldy Police Station, and getting him anything he needed to fulfil his role.
So you were showing him about, you were familiar with Kirkcaldy
Yes.
Police Office at that
Yes.
time. Was he not?
No, he wasn't a Fife officer.
So you were able to tell him where things were and
Yes.
that type of thing. And so you saw that as a position of support, a liaison officer.
Yes, that was my role.
So if there's any suggestion anywhere that you had a more formal role as deputy post-incident manager, you would not agree with that?
No, definitely not.
Right. And if somebody had been appointed as a deputy post-incident manager, how do you do you have an understanding of how that would be done?
No.
No. Were you involved in part of your support role in talking to the police officers who had been at Hayfield Road?
No.
Can we look at the next paragraph? I think you mentioned Conrad Trickett there. He came down and asked, would I act as his liaison officer? You've explained that. And then you see paragraph 79, I've been referred to my statement. This is the 15th of May 2015, so your operational statement at page 2, and it says about 11 o'clock in the morning, same date, I was requested to act in a support role to the post-incident manager who'd been appointed, Chief Inspector Conrad Trickett. I have been asked what happened in the 3 hours in between arriving and his request. I didn't have any direct supervision of the incident, so would have been supervising any other calls requiring our police response. I'm interested in maybe getting a little bit more information about what was happening between you arriving at 8 o'clock and you being appointed to this liaison officer role or support role to Conrad Trickett at about 11 o'clock in the morning. Can you help the chair understand what was going on then?
I can't obviously say what calls were coming in at that time without looking back the Storm command and control system, but this incident was obviously the priority, but the very nature of policing, there was also other calls that would come in that police required to respond to, and that would be what I would be diverting my attention to.
So that would be calls completely unrelated
Yes.
to the events at Hayfield Road?
Yes.
But you would be holding the fort, if you like, keeping an eye on those
Yes.
while other things are going on.
Yes.
And did you have any contact with Inspector Kay during those 3 hours?
I don't know. I may have been in the same room as him because sometimes inspectors would share the phone or share the computer systems, but I can't recall.
And when did you become aware that Mr. Bio had passed away?
I can't give you a time for that. It would be after 8 o'clock, but before 11 o'clock.
And during that time, do you have any understanding or recollection now about who was in charge of what was happening at Hayfield Road?
My understanding would be Inspector Stephen Kay until the more senior officers arrived.
And once the officers came back from Hayfield Road,
Yes.
we've heard evidence they came back to the canteen.
They did, yes.
Did you have an understanding or even a recollection now as to who was in charge once they got back to Kirkcaldy Police Office?
That would be Inspector Kay.
So in terms of the involvement of Conrad Trickett, he wasn't in charge at that time.
No, not at that time.
So his responsibilities began, I think you said, about 11 in the morning?
Yes.
Right. Thank you. Can I ask you about recovery of some items of clothing? Paragraph 81. Later that day, I'm not exactly sure of the time, I was requested if I would corroborate the taking of the female officers' clothing because they had to strip down to their underwear. And I'd like to ask you about the recovery of clothing. So tell us how you became involved with that aspect of your...
I was approached by one of the senior investigating officers who explained they were struggling to secure the services of another female officer, and they asked would I be willing to stay on duty and assist with that.
And this was for the recovery of the female officers'
Yes,
clothing?
yes.
And
Primarily, but there was other officers that we took clothing from as well,
Right.
male officers.
do you remember who the senior investigating officer was that
If I
asked you
look
to do
back in
that?
the statement, I think it's DCI Stuart Houston.
Right.
That's in my operational statement, second paragraph, third paragraph.
Third paragraph, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You
Yes.
were asked to do that. And tell us who DCI Stuart Houston was.
I believe he was part of the MIT team.
All right. We've heard some reference to the MIT team. And so he approached you. Who was the other female officer that they had secured?
I don't know this lady, but from my operational statement, it's DC Jennifer McCauley.
Thank you. And you agreed to carry out that task
Yes.
and be part of that process. Now, can I ask you first of all, before we move on, about paragraph 84? And you're asked about the canteen.
Yep.
And you say, I attended at the canteen within Kirkcaldy Police Office to ensure the welfare of the officers involved. By the time the officers had all returned to the canteen, I remember Amanda Given being present. We've heard that she was from SPF. The first time I went down was for a duration of approximately 5 minutes. I can't recall the exact time I went down there. It was probably mid-morning. So you said the first time you went down was for about 5 minutes. Was there a second time you went down or more times that you went down?
No, if you look down then, I went back with Conrad Trickett when he did the start of his post-incident management.
Right.
So that would be
let-
after 11 o'clock.
Is that at paragraph 90? or
90.
90. Let me just see. I went back to the canteen later with Mr. Trickett. It'll be in Mr. Trickett's statement because he was documenting his actions. He explained his role in his presence because the PIN was usually just for a firearms incident. They actually adapted that to fit the circumstances. So he explained what his role was to the officers. I didn't stay in the canteen with the other officers. I left with Conrad Trickett. Amanda Given stayed there as the constant person who was with them. That was her role as a Federation rep. So does that mean you were there twice in the canteen?
Yes.
So initially, if we can go back up to the earlier paragraph, 84, you went into the canteen to ensure the welfare of the officers involved. You were there about 5 minutes.
For an estimate, give or take.
Give or
5 minutes,
take.
yeah.
And during that time, Amanda Given was there.
Yes.
What did you do during the time you were first there?
When I first went down, as I said, it was a welfare visit to make sure the officers had refreshments, had coffee, tea, and just to make sure they were all back.
And so what did you do when you were there? Just ask them about that or check?
I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was just to make sure, are they all back? Do they need refreshments? But I can't recall my exact wording.
Do you remember any specific conversations with any of the officers?
I've explained this several times. There was no conversation. The only way I could describe it is, I'm not a doctor, but these officers were in shock. It was very silent. There was no conversations ongoing with them. They just sat there very silently.
Okay. And then the second time you went, if we can go back down to paragraph 90. So you were present with Mr. Trickett?
Yes.
And he was with you at all times then, was he, during the time
I
you were
stood
there?
behind him, yes.
You stood behind him. And he had a conversation at that time with the officers who were in the canteen. Did you say anything that time?
Did I say anything?
Did you say
No.
anything? No. And those were the only 2 times you were in the canteen?
Yes.
And do you remember how long you were in the canteen with Inspector Trickett, Chief Inspector Trickett?
No, but it wasn't a prolonged period of time.
Right.
Be on his notes.
If we have heard any evidence that Nicole Short had a conversation with you at that time about her vest,
Yeah.
do you have any recollection at all about that conversation?
No, none whatsoever.
Right. Thank you. You do know Nicole Short, I think you've
I
said
know
in
who
your
she is,
statement.
yes.
And she would recognise you, you would recognise
Yes.
her.
Yes.
Can we look at paragraph 94, please? And you're asked about the FME, Dr. Norrie, and you say you've seen her. I think I've observed her at Kirkcaldy Police Station previously, but can't recall any dealings with her. I didn't work in the custody suites, it's more the custody sergeants and inspectors who would work more closely with the FME and custody nurses. Now, I think at one point there was a question asked about whether you'd been involved with Dr Norrie or shared information with her. And I'm not going to go to that because we heard from Dr Norrie yesterday and she said she'd never had any conversations with you at all. That the conversation she'd had been with a nurse who'd phoned her to make the arrangements. So you can put to the back of your mind any suggestion now that you had a conversation. I think you were clear in your recollection you hadn't had a conversation
No,
with her.
but Perk asked,
Yeah.
what would I have said to Dr Norrie, and I had
Yeah.
no reason to dispute what they had said. I would say the man had a knife.
Yes, but Dr Norrie's confirmed that she did not actually have any direct contact with you on that day. Right, can I ask you about the seizing of the clothing and the equipment? Can we look further down, please, at paragraph, I think it's 99, seizing clothing and equipment. So you've referred back to your previous statement to Perk, and it said, from my previous statement, that would be your operational statement, I recall that at about 1808 to 1812 hours that day, Sunday the 3rd of May 2015, I, in the presence of Detective Constable Jennifer Macaulay, seized the clothing and equipment of Police Constable Nicole Short. And you say, I didn't take any clothing. It was DC Macaulay. We may hear that her name is now DC Bruce. In my presence, I was standing at the door to make sure no one else would come in and walk in while she was in her underwear. So you were there actually to just stop people interrupting.
Yes, and
the
to corroborate the
proceedings.
taking of the clothing.
And to see that she'd collected the right clothing from the right officer. And you say you'd never met Jennifer Macaulay before. She was at Tayside and worked in Dundee. I don't know where she came from, but she wasn't a 5 CID officer. She wasn't someone that you'd had any connection
No.
with prior to that. And then further down you say you also provided reassurance, officers with reassurance that the Federation were there to support them. Can I ask, when was it you were providing that reassurance? Was that at the first meeting with the canteen or later when you were there with Trickett?
I think this was from a Perk interview, was when the season of clothing was taking place.
All right, so it was reassurance to the officers whose clothing you were seizing.
Yes.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at the issue about forensic recovery of clothing? Now, there's been some evidence about the difference between seizing items and forensic recovery. And I wonder if you could just help us by explaining what those distinctions are.
I think the forensic recovery is to make sure there's no cross-contamination between the items that are taken, opposed to just physically seizing the items.
Right. And how would officers forensically recover an item?
Usually we'd use a protective white suit.
When you were corroborating the recovery of items, were you wearing a protective white suit?
I can't recall that, but if I go to my operational statement, you'll actually see that we've actually, at each time we've taken them off, we've taken the white suit. So that would infer to me I was wearing a white suit, as was DC Macaulay, but I can't recall wearing a white suit.
Right. But as part of your normal procedures, forensic recovery would be wearing a white suit,
Yes.
and then removing that,
Yes,
and then putting that in with
the items.
collecting that all together.
Yes.
So that's available for any future forensic analysis.
Yes.
Thank you. But that's not something that's done if you're just seizing an item from a police officer.
No.
Thank you. And as we've talked about you wearing a white suit, would that have been the same for the other female officer? She would also be wearing a white suit, recovering items.
DC Macaulay.
Yes, DC Macaulay or DC
Yeah,
Bruce.
I can't recall her actually wearing it, but from my operational statement, yes, we were both wearing white suits, we're put in the bags.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at paragraph 103, please? And you talk about, this is your inquiry statement, obviously. It was 7 years ago. I can't remember what was said, but there certainly would have been no dialogue with them. By this time, I think the females were getting a wee bit more agitated and upset while their clothes were taken. So this is you talking about the process of recovering the items. Unfortunately, I can't remember any conversations I had with Nicole. Either Perk or Mr. Salins asked me if I remember Nicole saying to me that she had been stamped on. I'm not saying she definitely didn't say that, but I can't remember her saying that to me. And so this really reflects your recollection now,
Yes.
and you just don't have any detailed recollection
No.
of that. And that remains the position today, does
It does.
Thank you. And then 104, I've been referred to my statement to Perk. So that's the second statement at page 2 and 3. I've been asked, and I cannot recall if Nicole Short told me if she'd been stamped on or kicked. I cannot recall if Nicole Short's equipment, specifically her body armour, had any marks, dirt or footprints on it, or if she pointed these out to me at the time. The clothing was not photographed whilst worn by the officers, nor when removed prior to being bagged as productions. I've been asked if this is still my understanding, to the best of my recollection. Yes. So I'd like to ask you about this paragraph, please. First of all, the clothing wasn't photographed whilst worn by the officers. When Nicole Short came in to have the recovery of her items, was she wearing all of her uniform or was she carrying some of it?
I can't recall.
No. And do you remember any of the photographs being taken? Obviously not while the examining.
No.
No, not at all.
Not in my presence.
Not in your presence. Would it be normal for photographs to be taken when items are recovered?
Not usually if you actually have the physical item. We would usually only photograph them initially if you had to hand the item back or it was a large structure you couldn't physically take possession of.
All right, thank you. And I'd like you to look at a vest, and this is an actual vest. It's in a package. And I won't be asking you to open that, but can you confirm that this is one of the items that you recovered on the 3rd of May 2015? And
Yes, that's my signature on the production label.
And what item is that?
That is Nicole Short's vest.
So that's the vest that you recovered from Nicole Short after 6 o'clock in the evening on the 3rd of May 2015.
Yes.
And then we see the photographs on the screen, which will just be brought up. That's photographs of the item. Now, can we leave it at that photograph, please? The second one on Perk 01176. Do you see on that photograph that there is a dark coloured mark
Yes.
on the rear of the police vest? Was that mark drawn to your attention by Nicole Short that day?
Oh, I can't recall that.
Do you remember seeing that mark?
No.
Had that mark been drawn to your attention by Nicole Short that day, what would you have said about it? What would you have done about it?
It depends on the significance of the mark. If I wasn't aware she had been stamped or kicked, a dirty mark on a piece of police clothing might not be significant. So it depends on what the significance of that was to me at that time.
So it would have been up to the individual officer to draw the significance to your attention if she wanted anything done about that?
Yes. Or for someone else. I'm not saying the officer had to do that.
No.
But if the senior investigating officer was aware that was pivotal to his inquiry, yes, we would be looking for that.
Thank you. And if an officer drew the attention of an inspector to a mark and said this is significant
Yes,
for some
yes.
reason, what would the inspector do about that?
We would obviously possibly tell the investigating officer to make sure we didn't lose that evidence, to make sure we took all steps to preserve it.
So when you say the investigating officer, would that be the senior investigating
Yes.
officer or the SIO?
Yes, SIO, yes.
So that would be information if it was shared,
Yes.
and the significance of it shared by an officer to an inspector,
Yes.
the inspector could share that with the SIO.
Yes.
And that would then be dealt with
Mhm.
as part of the overall investigation.
Yes.
But your recollection is, you have no recollection of that mark and no recollection of anyone saying to you it was significant.
Yes. No.
Thank you. So, would it be possible that an inspector such as yourself would just say to somebody, put that somewhere safe?
If you're asking if I personally, if I knew the significance of that and said, just go and put that someplace safe, no, I wouldn't have done that.
No.
No.
And why wouldn't you have done that?
Because it's a significant piece of evidence.
Yeah. And if you had had that drawn to your attention, is it the sort of thing that you might have noted in your operational statement?
Yes, and sought clarity over.
Thank you. Can I ask you about, I think it's in your inquiry statement, but we can discuss this. Can I ask you about the microfleece? We hear that PC Nicole Short was wearing clothing underneath her body armour or her vest, and one of the things was called a microfleece.
Mm-hmm.
Can you, I think you call it, it's quite thin material, and I'm wondering if you can help us understand what a microfleece is. Is it a standard piece of clothing that's worn by police officers?
All police officers should wear their standard authorised clothing, but some officers, for different reasons, may purchase something themselves that they would wear to potentially keep warmer if they needed to. So I don't know whether you're talking about a police standard issue microfleece or one that the officer has purchased herself to wear on duty.
Right. Is a microfleece something that police officers are issued with?
Yes,
And is it thin material?
it is quite thin, yes.
Yeah. Can I ask you about your notebook on the
Yes.
3rd of May? And I think it's paragraph 117 of your inquiry statement. Now, I appreciate you weren't at Hayfield Road, but what was your understanding of your obligations in relation to completion of notebook entries in May 2015?
I had no reason not to complete my notebook, so my notebook was completed as you would expect it to be completed for the duties I undertook.
And you've said that if I thought the action I had taken would have been pivotal to any subsequent inquiries, I would have taken notes. However, as I have stated, I did not deem any actions I took were part of the evidential chain.
Yes.
And I just wondered if you could explain what your understanding is of that.
What I mean by that is you're asking me now, 7 years later, for times, specific times. So if I thought those would have been pivotal, for example, when I walked into the canteen, when I walked out of the canteen, I would have put them in my notebook. But the notes in my notebook are what you would expect regarding the season of productions, when I started duty, when I finished duty.
And is it fair to say that your operational statement, which you completed, would have been from your recollection and from entries in your notebook?
And from my notebook, yes.
Thank you. And it dealt with what you consider to be your significant involvement with
Yes.
those events. And then finally, you're asked to deal with the PC Allen Payton complaint, and you've been asked some questions about a complaint that you were involved in. You say, I think Alan Payton's complaint was about parking. And so just to be clear, these paragraphs are about a complaint that had been made about PC Payton, and that you had some involvement in, and it was limited involvement in, and you've made that clear. As we look through these paragraphs, I think you took a statement, so we'll go through those
I
paragraphs.
didn't take a statement.
Oh, sorry. We'll go through the paragraphs. 120 next, please. I was only present from my recollection, presumably at one house when the statement of complaint was noted. So you didn't take that statement, you were present
Yes.
when the statement was taken. And that's the extent of your...
Yes, I can't even give you the year or date or anything like that, as you could see from that, but I was asked about that.
Right. And you say at 1-to-1, it's very seldom we would go unaccompanied to note a complaint. Some other inspector had a statement to note, and I would go as his corroborating officer. But only one inspector would note a statement of complaint, and that was not yourself.
No.
And at 122, I've been asked if I was involved in the decision making for this complaint. No, that's the investigating officer's decision, and on that occasion it was a different inspector. I wouldn't be involved in that. I don't remember the outcome of this complaint. So you had a very limited involvement, if I can say it that way, with this aspect that you've been asked about.
Yes.
And your recollection now is very limited as well.
I don't even know when that was.
Right. All right. Thank you very much. That completes my
Are there any
examination.
Rule 9 applications? Ms Mitchell. Ms Combe, would you mind going back to the witness room while I hear a submission? Yes, Ms Mitchell. Yes.
Yes, sir, there are two issues. The first of those issues follows paragraph 50, where the witness, paragraph 50 of her inquiry statement, where she said, following the tragic incident, there were concerns that there could be negative and adverse reaction from the ethnic minority community in Fife, and the breakdown in our engagement with these communities, which could manifest in demonstration and protest. And she notes as her evidence, however, due to the continued, I think, positive community engagement and dialogue, this was avoided. Meetings took place with community leaders where any concerns could be addressed and discussed. The first issue in relation that I want to ask about are questions around the concerns that police had. So the questions that I would like to ask are, how soon after the death of Sheikha Bayo were there concerns that there might be a negative and adverse reaction? Whether or not by that she meant demonstration or protest. To ask her whether or not she was one of the people who had those concerns, to find out who else had those concerns, and importantly to find out why did they have those concerns. If there was a discussion about that. And finally, would she have expected the concerns, if she was one of the people that held them, and other officers did, would she have expected the officers in the canteen to have these same sorts of concerns? The second issue relates to matters of the community, and in particular those members of the community being Sheikha Bayo's family and the issue of protest. And the following questions would like to be asked in order to assist the inquiry with a proper understanding of the situation. This inquiry may come to hear in the future that demonstrations and protests did take place, which of course were peaceful and legal, but there was a breakdown with the Bayo family. And what I would like to ask this witness was whether or not she was aware there was a complete breakdown in relationships between family liaison officers and the Bayo family in the days following Sheikha Bayo's death. I would like to ask about the meeting with community leaders, in particular whether or not she was aware if the family of Sheikha Bayo was invited, because she said that it was not all community leaders and others in the community were present. I would like to ask if she can recall what the purpose of the meeting was, and if the meetings were in May, which I think she said she thought it was, given the fact that the police officers hadn't yet given any statements, what information or what discussions could she recall about that? And finally, moving on to the Bayo family themselves in protest, were you aware of demonstrations and rallies that the Bayo family participated in not just in Kirkcaldy but through Scotland, including the 7th of June, where there's a march of 1,000 people outside the police station, a minute's silence, and literally a banner which said, "We want justice, and without truth there can be no justice." 2 major marches of other protests, and September a meeting in the community centre, and October another rally in Kirkcaldy. And also whether or not this witness was aware that the Bio family campaigned for some 5 years for the VRR and for the public inquiry, and also whether or not this witness was aware of the name Sheikh Bio being carried at Black Lives Matter demonstrations throughout Scotland. And this is particularly because of her part, that she says that she was involved in community relations in Kirkcaldy at that time. So it's against that background I would like to ask these questions.
In relation to the first issue, I shall allow you to explore the issues in relation to the concerns. In relation to the second issue, I would draw a distinction between the immediate aftermath of the 3rd of May and the much broader matters that you mentioned towards the end. I would draw the line at the 7 June matter. So you can ask about the aftermath up to, but the subsequent issues I will not allow you to ask at this stage.
And can I just clarify, in relation to those matters, whether or not that would include asking a question of whether or not they were aware of the name of Sheikh Bio being carried at Black Lives Matter demonstrations?
Yes, that's much later.
Well,
Is it?
Well, I'm not sure that it would be. I'm just wondering if that was much later. We know the dates of inquiry, the dates of certain marches on the 7th of June. And
so
we
it was the 7th of June 2015?
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
And we also know the meeting with the community was in May. So is the inquiry just suggesting that the questions about the VRR should not be included? And
no. I would restrict your questions to matters occurring in May and June 2015.
I'm obliged.
And on that basis, I shall allow you to ask the questions. So if you can rearrange the sit-in, please. We can have the witness back, please. Ms. Combe, you're going to be asked some questions by Ms. Mitchell, who's the Senior Counsel for the Bio families. Ms. Mitchell.
Thank you. I wonder if we could have on screen the inquiry statement of Inspector Combe, in particular paragraph 50. Now, you'll recall being asked some questions by my learned friend about this already. Yes. I would like to ask you some more questions, if I may, about that. As we see there, it says, following the tragic incident, there were concerns that there could be a negative and adverse reaction from the ethnic minority community in Fife and a breakdown in engagement with communities manifesting in demonstration and process. Demonstration and protest. Now, what I would like to ask you, first of all, is how soon after the death of Sheikh Bio were there concerns that there might be an adverse and negative reaction?
I couldn't give you a timescale on that. I would say it would be quite quickly after that. Didn't any victim of any crime or any incident, very quickly that would be one of the community impact assessments. So it doesn't have to be race, it could be it was a young person It could be any number of things that we take into consideration after an incident.
Okay. And when you've identified that, you've said quite quickly, I'm wondering if we could explore, do you mean on that day would there have been concerns?
I would think so as senior management, yes, it'd be part of your community impact assessment.
And were you one of the people that had those concerns? Did you have a concern given your
I
role?
wasn't part of the senior management team, but from the work I have done with the communities, yes, that would be a concern.
And you would say that not only you would have that concern, but you imagine senior management would have that
I
concern
can't talk
too.
for senior management, but I would presume so.
Why did you have those concerns?
As I said, after any incident involving the police, whether it's a young person who's died on the road, whether it's an incident like this, you've got to look around and see what impact is that going to have on the community.
And I'd like you to look at this particular
Yes.
instance. Why in this particular instance did you have an apprehension that there might be negative and adverse reaction?
Because of the gentleman's heritage.
What do you mean by that?
He's a black male.
And why did that make you think that there would be negative and adverse reaction?
Well, if I'm being perfectly honest with you, it's after anything, whether it's worldwide or in the country, if it is to do with an ethnic minority, the media will come on the back of that.
And is there a particular residence with black men in police custody?
No. Not in Fife, no.
Well, in general, though, you were talking about...
In general, if you look at the media reporting, there's plenty of media reporting throughout the years about black people being taken into custody, your stop and search down in England.
Was it one of your concerns that because Mr. Bio was black, there might be an adverse
Potentially, yes.
reaction?
Yes.
You say that there were concerns that there could be a negative and adverse reaction. You have indicated that you have that concern. Who else had that concern? I'm just
I couldn't
reflecting upon...
Couldn't comment on that.
Well, you see, there were concerns, so I'm looking to help the inquiry with where those concerns arise. How did you know about those concerns?
Because they were my concerns.
Okay. And were you the person then that acted to carry out the community engagement and dialogue?
I was present at some of those, yes.
And when you were present at that, did other people express their concerns about the possibility of a negative and adverse
Are you
reaction?
talking about other persons as in the police community
Yes.
or as in the wider community?
In the police community?
Yes, in the police community, yes.
And were those discussions had presumably before you reached out to ethnic minority communities in
They would have
Kirkcaldy?
been, yes.
Do you remember those discussions?
No.
Do you remember any meetings about
No.
them? Would you have expected the officers who were in the canteen to have the same sorts of concerns?
Not all of them, because some of them were very new into the organisation and might not have had that exposure previously.
We've had evidence that some of the officers, for example, Walker and Peyton, were extremely experienced officers. Would you have expected them to have those sorts of concerns?
As I've already said, it depends on their exposure to these kinds of incidents. When it's involving an ethnic minority community. If police officers have never dealt with the ethnic minority community, they might not have those concerns. It might not be first and foremost in their mind.
Well, would you have expected police officers to be aware of the worldwide media about black men dying in police custody?
It would be an expectation, but I would say I can't speak for every police officer that they do keep up to date with current affairs.
I'd like to move on to another issue.
Thank you.
This issue is in order to assist the inquiry with a proper understanding of the situation just post the death of Sheikh Ubayo. You have indicated already at paragraph 50 that due to the continued positive community engagement and dialogue, this was avoided, and by this it means demonstration and protest. Now, during the preceding days after Mr. Bayo's death in police custody, were you aware of large-scale events
No.
Were you aware of a large-scale event on the
And-
7th of June?
And where are you talking about this large-scale event? Is that in Fife or Edinburgh,
In
Glasgow?
Fife.
In Fife. There was one. I couldn't give you the date. There was an event in Fife.
And if I were to suggest to you that that was a march which stopped outside the police station,
Yes, that's the one I'm referring to.
do you remember anything about that particular
As I've said, I
event?
wouldn't class that as a demonstration or a protest. There was no hostilities that I'm aware of. It was very dignified by all those involved. But yes, I'm aware there was an event.
Were you aware that there was a minute's silence
Yes.
outside the police station? Can you tell us anything else about that?
No.
No. Now, you say you wouldn't class that as a demonstration or a protest, but of course demonstrations and protests are
Yes.
completely
Yes.
legal
Yes.
and can be done peacefully.
Yes.
Now, the inquiry will come to hear that there will be evidence that the Bio family in fact stood with a banner which said, "We want answers, and without truth there can be no justice." Do you recall seeing that?
I don't recall seeing that at Kirkcaldy, but I have seen that in the media.
And were you present at that?
No.
Do you have any recollection of any other meetings in Kirkcaldy in the days or weeks preceding that?
No.
A rally,
No.
a meeting at a community hall?
No.
You have already explained to us that you didn't consider these demonstrations or protests because what you were thinking of when you meant that was something.
What? I'll clarify that for you then. What I'm meaning by is a large-scale disturbance. As I say, yes, I take on board what you're saying. They can be classed as a protest, a demonstration, but there was no hostilities, there was no arrest that I'm aware of.
Were you aware that there was a breakdown in relations between the police and the family liaison officers and the Bio family in the days following Sheikha Bio's death?
No.
Did you have any interaction with the family liaison officers at all?
Did I personally?
Yes.
No.
You spoke also about the meeting with community leaders.
Yes.
And it would be fair to say you can't remember a huge amount
No.
about that. Is that correct?
That's right.
Can you remember what the purpose of that meeting was for?
From my recollection, it was just to have that engagement still with the community, so if there was any underlying issues, we could try and address them.
And what underlying issues might those be?
There could be anything, a lack of communication, a lack of information sharing, feeling that they were being persecuted, being targeted by other members of the community, but there was none of that from my recollection.
At that particular time, if your understanding is correct, and the meeting was in May, you
I
would
said I couldn't remember if I said it would be May or June.
May or June.
Yes.
If it was May or June. What information could you have given at that stage about the circumstances of Sheikha Bio's death?
We couldn't have shared anything about the circumstances, but the community impact is to see how the community are feeling about that incident or any other incidents.
Were you aware whether or not the Bio family were invited to the meeting of community leaders?
The Bio family have a member of their family who's part of Free Fife, and they were invited.
So through Free Fife?
Yes, and there was a member of Free Fife there, and a member of their family is quite a influential member of Free Fife.
Were you? Do you have any information that anyone else in the family was invited to that meeting?
Oh, I couldn't tell you who the invite list was.
Okay. So any invite that was given to a body of whom a member is a party of that group, but not the family itself?
I couldn't tell you.
No further questions.
Ms Combe, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. I'm going to rise now in order that the next witness can be introduced, and you'll be free to go then. So,
Sorry, Maud, I did forget to ask a question,
uh,
which was about the makeup of the community leaders.
yes, very well. A supplementary question.
I'm sorry.
No,
You have indicated to us briefly the makeup of the community leaders, and I wonder if I can explore that with you in a
Yes, of
little more
course.
detail. You described the Imam of the mosque.
Yes.
Can you tell us who else that you thought was there?
The leader of the Fife Arabic community, Free Fife, business leaders, anyone who's actually been interactive with the police from any of the communities is what I would say is somebody who's influential and we could get a message through.
And what people of that group were members of the black community?
Free Fife.
And is the particular person that you're referring to in relation to Free Fife, that particular person isn't a member of the Bio family that was there that day?
He was, yes, it was someone else other than the member of the Bio family who I've said is a member of Free Fife.
And do you know who that person was?
I believe it's Naheem is his first name. I don't know his surname.
No further questions.
Thank you. Now, Miss Graham, who's the next witness?
The next witness is Samantha Davidson.
Miss Davidson, are you a detective inspector, is that right?
Temporary Detective Inspector at the moment.
Would you take the oath, please?
Yes.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Graham.
Thank you. You are Samantha Davidson.
Yes.
And what age are you?
38.
And tell us how many years service you now have.
17.
And in 2015?
10 years service.
And your rank now, you've just told the chair, you're temporary detective inspector.
Yes, that's correct.
And in 2015, were you a DS, a detective sergeant?
Yes.
And we've heard people talk about the CID officers. Is that one that you're that person?
Yes.
Thank you. And your contact details are all known to us, so I'm not going to ask you to say what they are. Have you had the chance to see other aspects of evidence that we've had in the inquiry?
Some, not all. But
Some. Right, you may have seen me refer officers and witnesses to the black folder in front of you. So have a look in that, and that should contain 4 statements, and I'm going to take you through all of them now. So the first one was a self-penned statement dated the 4th of May 2015. I don't actually know what order they are in your folder, but it'll also come up on the screen as we go through it. So this is Samantha Davidson, and you'll see it says 4th May 2015, 12:25, done by yourself at Kirkcaldy Police Office.
yes, that's correct.
Right. And when you prepared this was just the day after the events of
Yes.
the 3rd of May. Were you doing your best to give to give a true and accurate recollection or record of what had happened the day before?
Yes.
And then can we look at Perk 184? And we'll see that this is a statement by you on the 29th of May 2015 at 11:10, taken by investigators John McCauley and Kevin Rooney at Kirkcaldy Police Office.
Yes.
And we've heard that these are investigators from Perk, and so they took a statement from you on that date. And again, were you doing your best to give a true and accurate record of what happened?
Yes, I was.
Thank you. And were you given the chance to change anything?
Just to clarify from my original self-penned statement, yes.
Right. So this was about clarifying your original statement. And then look at number 3, Perk 185, please. And this is a statement of the 2nd of June 2015, 17:20, by John Ferguson, investigating officer again at Kirkcaldy Police Office. And again, on this date, were you doing your best to give a true and accurate record of what happened?
Yes, that's correct.
And again, were you given the chance to clarify or make any changes if you wished?
Yes.
Thank you. And then finally, can we look at the inquiry statement? And we'll see that this is your inquiry statement taken by a member of the team on the 9th of March 2022. And if we can look at the last page, you'll see there's a paragraph there which says at 39, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. And then we should be able to see, we'll have a, yes. So we see that there was a signature there. It's been redacted on the copy that we see on the screen. But on your hard copy, you should see your signature on all the pages.
Yes, that's correct.
And that was dated, signed by you on 26th of April 2022. So when I go through things, I'll ask for particular paragraphs or pages to be brought up on the screen. But at all times, you're going to have the full hard copy. And if you think there's an area you'd like to refer to, please just tell us. We can bring that up on the screen as well.
Okay, no problem.
So feel free to use those hard copies in any way. And in addition to the folder with your statements in it, you should see a spreadsheet which has been printed off. It's a combined audio and video timeline. Now, if you've managed to watch any of the evidence, you may have seen me refer people to this, witnesses to this. You'll see on the left, there's timings given in the 24-hour clock. So for example, the first one's 7:09 in the morning, 20 seconds to 33 seconds. And then to the left of centre of the spreadsheet, you'll see a list of airwave transmissions that are transcribed. And then to the right of centre, you'll see a very brief description of events that are said to be happening in the CCTV or in the footage. And on the right hand side, you'll see the source of that, the video extract.
Okay.
Now, you may have seen in the hearings, or you may have seen on the news, that we've also got a evidence video timeline which combines all the footage, and that'll be on the screen, and I might ask you questions about that.
Okay.
You might have seen witnesses touch the screen and a red circle appears. We might be doing that as part of your evidence as well.
Okay.
But if you're not clear about anything, just tell me and I'll explain what we want to do.
Okay, no problem.
Great, thank you very much. So, let's start with your inquiry statement, if I may, paragraph 5. And you've said at around 7:15 in the morning, you were in the CID office in Kirkcaldy Police Office when I heard a transmission over the radio regarding a black male in possession of a knife in the area of Henry Road, Kirkcaldy. I understood this was a priority 1 call requiring immediate response. DC Connell and I acknowledged the call along with uniformed officers. While this was a call for uniformed officers rather than CID, Kirkcaldy Police Office was very short-staffed at that time. That, together with the serious nature of the call, made us respond to the call. I'd like to ask you some general questions about this. Now, we've heard officers talk about the CID officers. Are you quite a distinct group of officers compared to other uniformed officers in a police station?
And distinct in that we wear different uniform. A CID officer will routinely wear suits as opposed to the normal standard police uniform. And the distinction is what crimes we lead on as opposed to what crimes the uniform lead on. So we would lead on serious, protracted crimes as opposed to maybe your kind of volume crime that response deal with.
So things like murders or serious assaults, that type of thing. And you would be dressed in suits rather than this sort of standard police uniform.
Yep, that's correct.
So you're quite easily distinguished compared to other officers, maybe in a scene. You can be seen because of your normal
Yep.
clothing, smart clothing. And do you have a separate office then with CID officers in Kirkcaldy Police Office?
Yeah, at the time, we don't have a CID office there just now, but at the time we had a separate CID office as from uniform.
So do you form a unified group?
Yep.
Distinct from the less serious business that other officers conduct and engage in?
Yep.
And you've mentioned a DC Connell.
Yes.
Who was he?
He was one of my detectives that was on duty that morning, DC Derek Connell.
So DC Derek Connell was one of your constables.
Yes.
And at that time, were you a detective sergeant?
Yes.
Right. So you've been promoted on a temporary basis since then.
Yes.
How long had you been a sergeant in May 2015?
I was promoted in June of 2014, so only just shy of a year.
Just shy of a year. And how many officers did you have under your command?
In Kirkcaldy, I had 3 or 4. In Glenrothes, I likewise had 3 or 4. So anything up to about 8 DCs.
So we've heard about other officers who are maybe senior officers, but their teams were in the one office. You actually spanned 2 offices with your
Yeah, so Fife is separated into central, east and west. So I would cover the central area, which would encompass Kirkcaldy and Glenrothes.
Right. And you've said that Kirkcaldy Police Office was very short-staffed at that time. Now, do you mean in relation to CID officers or in relation to uniformed officers?
Probably across the board.
And what do you mean it was very short-staffed?
In terms of the team numbers, essentially we changed to Police Scotland. A lot of changes had occurred. A lot of staffing had moved nationally. So yeah, we were going through a big change at that time.
And we may hear that it was a time of considerable change in the organisation.
Yes.
So still feeling the effects of the change to Police Scotland from the individual regions or areas.
Yes, that's correct.
That'd be fair.
Yep.
And you said that this was a serious call that you heard, and so you also acknowledged that call for that reason. And what was it that made you consider it a serious call?
High risk in terms of safety. So, you know, essentially you hear it as an immediate priority one call, and any officer, regardless of specialism, rank, can go to an immediate one call.
Right. So when there's calls, for example, we've heard about all units being called for, there's not a small group of CID officers who ignore all of that. You're still part of the response.
Yes.
And if all units are called for, that would include CID officers
Yes,
as well.
it can include, yeah, depending on commitments, but it can include us.
So if you were involved in some serious investigation at that moment, you wouldn't be available. But if you are available, you would be part of the all units call.
Yes, absolutely.
And you said it was high risk for safety. Whose safety?
Officer safety, in terms of the dispatching officers, but predominantly it's the safety of the community and the subject male.
Right, thank you. If Kirkcaldy Police Office had not been very short-staffed, would you have responded to this call?
Absolutely.
So the staffing didn't actually matter to
No.
your decision
It
to
was my
respond?
initial, it was a consideration, but I would have still, I'm a police officer and that's my core responsibility. I would have still responded to that call.
That's still your priority. And DC Connell, did he go with you?
Yes.
And had you attended that type of call, a knife call or a knife incident, from Kirkcaldy Police Office before?
Very likely. I would, very often back up uniform at immediate calls, or likewise, if we were the closest unit, we would get dispatched to that call ourselves.
All right. And so you've experienced or had experience in 2015 of responding to knife incidents and knife calls?
I can't think specifically to knife calls, but certainly immediate calls. Whether that involved a knife or not, I'm unsure.
Can you explain to me the distinction between immediate calls and knife calls?
Immediate call could be a call that's graded grade 1 with immediate threat 2. It doesn't mean that it's a knife. It could be a large-scale disturbance. It could be, a domestic incident with a serious nature. It doesn't have to be. It's just graded that it's a life-threatening.
Right. So grade 1, immediate threat to life, but it could be from any means or source or as a result of anything. But if that call came in, you would respond to that. So it may not be a knife call.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at paragraph 7, please? And you've said that you collected your equipment. The yard by that time was empty of police vehicles as the uniformed officers had already left shortly before to respond to the incident. DC Connell and I left the car park area of Kirkcaldy Police Station in a marked CID vehicle. This was a silver Vauxhall Corsa. DC Connell was driving, and driving time from Cape and Hayfield Road is approximately 3 to 5 minutes. So it's a very short journey. DC Connell was driving. Are you and he familiar with Hayfield Road in the area?
Yeah, I'd worked in Kirkcaldy my full service for 10 years, so I was fully aware of Hayfield Road. So
we've heard there's hospitals in the area and churches and houses. You were fully aware. So as you're driving to Hayfield Road, were you listening to the radio messages coming over the police radio?
Yes.
So, and is that a way of keeping yourself up to date on what's happening at the scene?
Yes.
Thank you. You've said we did not have blue lights or sirens in our car. We responded as quick as we could. So you've said it was a marked police car, but does that mean there were no sirens or lights on it?
There's no sirens and lights, but at that time there was a Police Scotland emblem kind of taping like on the bonnet of the vehicle, so it was identifiable as a police vehicle, but it was not kind of fitted with sirens or lights.
So not the normal sort of equipment that would
No.
be fitted to that car. And during the journey to Hayfield Road, we heard the emergency button activation. This indicates that an officer requires assistance. We then heard that PC Short had been injured. At that time, there was no exact detail of who was responsible or the extent of her injuries. So the first thing you heard was an emergency button activation, and then that an officer was injured,
Yep.
PC Short. We've heard that when the emergency button's activated, the radio vibrates for the officers who are attending. Is that what happened?
Yeah, it vibrates and goes red.
And the screen goes
Yeah.
red. And so at that stage, you didn't know. You told us you knew about the knife, the calls that had come in, but you didn't know what injuries PC Short had or the extent of those injuries.
No.
So what was going through your head at that time as you responded?
Essentially, when we heard the emergency button being pushed, we were only just leaving the backyard of Kirkcaldy Police Station. With the context of the call and information known, my gut reaction was an officer had been stabbed. That was quickly reported back on the radio that it was PC Short and she'd been physically injured. And I think it was, confirmation that she had not been stabbed. So at that stage, when the emergency button goes, obviously fear, adrenaline heightens, and you just want to get there to make sure everybody's okay.
All right. I'm going to be asking you some questions this afternoon about the events, and we'll look at the spreadsheet and go through that. Would that be inappropriate?
Yes, certainly. We'll stop for lunch and sit at 2 o'clock.